Okay, I guess we'll get started. So, aloha everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Pacific Historic Parks History Talk series. I'm Weston Saito, the Education and Interpretation Research Coordinator for Pacific Historic Parks. We are the nonprofit organization who works in partnership with the National Park Service. Together, we support Pearl Harbor National Memorial in Hawaii, home of the USS Arizona Memorial, Warner Pacific National Historical Park in Guam, American Memorial Park in Saipan, Kalapapa National Historical Park in Molokai, and Diamond Head State Monument in Hawaii. Our mission is to remember, honor, and understand World War II in the Pacific through education and interpretive programs. We strive to carry on the memory of historical events and honor those who were involved. Today, we are honored to have as our guest author Teresa R. Funke, who has written multiple books about World War II. And today she will be speaking about her author journey and her books and how it all started with her first book, Remember Wake. So let's all introduce Teresa. Hello, Teresa.
Hello, how are you?
Good. So let me just, all right. And go ahead if you wanted to.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Weston, and thank you to Pacific Historic Parks for inviting me to present today. I'm a big fan of the park. I love your backdrop. I've been there myself and I did a book signing for you guys, and you've carried my books in your museum gift shop for quite a while now, which I really appreciate. It's so much fun for me when my friends and fans send me pictures and say, look, I saw your books in the Pearl Harbor Museum gift shop. And so I've really enjoyed our relationship, our working relationship. And so I thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. And I wanted to just start by introducing myself. My name is Teresa Funke, and I'm an author. I live in Colorado, but I actually grew up in Idaho. And I lived there until I was 25 years old. And when I was a kid, I loved history. By the time I was in 4th grade, I knew that history was my favorite subject. And I really enjoyed learning about history, all history, American history in particular, and British history, which is kind of interesting. So those were my 2 main areas of interest all through growing up, from elementary school, middle school, high school. History was my favorite thing. And so was writing. I loved writing. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on when we do the Q&A. But I knew I wanted to be a writer when I grew up, and I thought to write about history. And so I actually got a degree in history from Boise State University. And Boise State is obviously in the city of Boise, which has a kind of an interesting connection to World War II. So the entire time I was growing up, remember I said I loved history, and I was interested in World War II. I'd read lots of books about World War II by the time I was a history student at Boise State. And yet somehow I did not know that some of the real heroes of World War II lived right there in my town. And so I found that out when I wrote my first book, Remember Wake. And I'm going to talk about that book a little bit first. So if we can show the cover, Weston, that would be great. Oh, there's all my books. That's great. Okay, so Remember Wake. This is my first novel. So I was working for a PBS series in Idaho, and I was sent out to interview a civilian survivor of the Battle of Wake Island. And I, again, had not heard this story, even though I grew up in Boise, and this is very much a Boise story, because the civilian contract workers that were sent out to Wake Island to build a military base, their headquarters was Morrison-Knudsen, and it was headquartered in Boise, Idaho. So a lot of the civilian men who went to Wake Island were from my hometown, and I had not met them or known of them until I worked for this PBS series, and I was sent out to interview a man named Clint Hackenstad. And he told me this amazing story about the war. So you can see Wake Island there. It's a little horseshoe-shaped coral atoll, very tiny. It's 2,300 miles west of Pearl Harbor. So it's way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If you can find it on a map, you're going to have to search for it. It's super tiny, and it's entirely by water. And these men were sent out to build the base on the island. So Clint Hackenstad and his fellow civilian contract workers happened to be there when Wake Island was attacked the same day the harbor was attacked, which we all know was December 7th, 1941. But Wake Island is across the international date line, so it was actually December 8th for them, but it was still the same day. So they were attacked by the Japanese on the same day as Pearl Harbor. A lot of people didn't know that. I didn't know that. So as Clint Hackenstad told me this story of being on the island and going through the Battle of Wake Island, so the Japanese tried to invade the island on December 11th, and the civilian contract workers and a small detachment of Marines that were on the island were able to them. And then the island was actually overrun on December 23rd. And the men were taken prisoner, the Marines and the civilians alike, by the Japanese. And they spent the entire rest of the war in prison camps in Japan and China. Now, to me, this was amazing. To have survived the Japanese prisoner of war camps for 4 years was an incredible feat, because 40% of the prisoners in Japanese camps died. So the fact that I was even able to talk to this man who had survived so much was amazing to me. So I am a novelist. I write fiction, but I base all my stories on true stories. So when it came time to write my first book, Remember Wake, I decided I was going to write about the civilian contract workers, because they were not very well known in history at that time. They were mentioned in a few nonfiction history books, but their story had not been told. Interestingly, neither had the story of their wives. So as I was interviewing Hackenstad, his wife was sitting next to him and she was saying to him, "Don't forget to tell her this and don't forget to tell her that." And she knew his story inside and out, which I thought was really interesting. But then I got to wondering, wait a minute, what was this experience like for her as the wife of a Wake Island civilian? And I found out from her that it was a very difficult time for women. So the women who were the wives of the civilians, because the men were civilians, the Red Cross could not track them. So the women did not know throughout the entire war if their men had survived the Battle of Wake Island or if they were alive in the camps. So for 4 years, they went without that knowledge. They also, because the men were civilians, did not receive support from the government. So they didn't receive funding from the government as a military wife would. So these women were completely on their own and their husbands were missing. So I wanted to tell their story as well. So Remember Wake is a novel. It's told in rotating chapters. So first you read a chapter about Colin, then you read one about Maggie, and the story goes back and forth and lets you know what happened to the men in the camps and what was happening to the women back home. Really unique story. I was the first person in 50 years at the time, this was in the early 90s, to ever ask the women what they had gone through and experienced in the Wake Island story. So this is an amazing story. And if you look up Wake Island, you're going to see that there is a rock there that is a tribute to 98 men. Those 98 men were the contract workers that the Japanese held back. They did not send them to the camps. They held them back to use them as forced labor on the island. And in October of 1943, they executed those 98 men. So when you look at pictures of Wake Island on the internet, you're going to see that rock, which is now a tribute to 98 men who were executed on the island. Now, civilian contract workers came back. So I interviewed 13 of them and I took the best parts of the stories and I put them into the main characters. So this book is 90% true. Almost everything you read in the book actually happened to one or the other of the men and women that I interviewed, which is a pretty interesting and unique way to tell a fictional story. But for me, it was really important to get those details in there and to remember what they had been through to the best of my ability. So it's a very, very engaging story. It's a total page turner. It's amazing what these people went through. And I'm really, really proud of this book. So that was the first book. And now we're going to talk about the second book. The second book was also written for adults, just like Remember Wake was. And this book is called Dancing in Combat Boots. And this story is women's stories from World War II. So this book came about because as I was writing Remember Wake, which is a novel, I needed to understand what it felt like during the war. Well, in the early 90s, there were not that many books that talked about women in that sense. There were a few nonfiction books that talked about women. For example, books that talked about the 6 million women who entered the workforce for the first time. And there were books that talked about specific types of women, people who were nurses or spies during the war, but not what it felt like to be a woman on the home front. So I decided to write this book, Dancing in Combat Boots. It was originally a nonfiction book. It was an oral history collection. An oral history collection means that I interviewed the women and I was going to tell their stories in their own words, kind of like a reporter would. So in the end, when we went to sell this book, we found out that oral history collections don't sell very well, and so publishers were nervous about publishing that type of book. So I spent 2 years, because I could not give up on these women's stories, rewriting this book as short stories. So each book is now a short story based on each of the 10 women that I interviewed. Now, these stories are about 85% true, so I did have to make up a little bit to hold the stories together. But it's an amazing collection because from the beginning, I knew that I wanted to include women from different socioeconomic groups, different ethnic groups across the country, so that we could see what it was like to be a woman during World War II. So there is a woman in the book who was in a Japanese internment camp. There's a woman who was an African-American WAC, was an American soldier segregated by both her race and her gender. There's a woman who was a Mexican-American woman who ran a grocery store in World War II in San Antonio. And she told me that to be a woman in a position of power in a macho neighborhood was something new for that time period. So women made incredible strides in the 1940s. They were allowed to do things they'd never been allowed to do, including flying planes for the military. So there's a WASP in one of my stories who is ferrying planes for the military. And there are women in the book that are working in unusual jobs, including a woman who was working on the Manhattan Project. So it's a really wonderful story, and each one is based on a real woman that I interviewed. In the back of the book, you'll find an epilogue that tells you about what happened to each woman that I interviewed. Now, interestingly, that story about the Mexican-American woman in the grocery stores in Antonio, that's my great aunt. So my family was Mexican-American, and that is her story. And so it was really fun to get a little bit of my family history into this book as well. And so you're going to see there, that's a propaganda from World War II. You would have seen these hanging up in public places to encourage women to enter the workforce and to find the job that suited them. I love this one because it talks about industry, agriculture, and business, which are all of the types of women that are represented in my book. So this is a really wonderful book, very popular with book clubs too. And I also wrote this one for adults, although like Remember Wake, a lot of teenagers reading this book now too, which makes me really happy. So now we're going to talk about my children's books. And the first children's book is called Doing My Part. And Doing My Part, again, is based on a real person that I interviewed, and that's her. That's Shirley Brand. So Shirley was a kindergarten teacher for 35 years in Greeley, Colorado. And I actually met her at the library. She was volunteering, and I was working on a research project for a museum. And we got to talking. Originally, I wanted Shirley's story about being a child during the war to be in my book, Dancing in Combat Boots. But it didn't quite fit for a child's point of view to be in the collection once the collection was assembled. So I started getting invited, because of my first 2 books, to classrooms to speak about writing and World War II, mostly 5th grade classrooms, sometimes 4th grade. And what was so much fun about these visits is oftentimes we would go over time because the kids would be so interested in the war and they have so many questions for. On a couple of occasions, they opted to skip recess to hear me keep talking. So it came to my conclusion that this war was of great interest to students and to children. And at one of the visits, one of the kids, a 5th grader, said to me, "Mrs. Funk, these stories are so interesting. Why don't you write something for kids so we can read about the war too?" So I did. I started writing a children's series. I had to back up and learn how to write for children because writing for children is very different than writing for adults. So my first book in the Homefront Heroes series is called Doing My Part, and it's based on Shirley. So I went back to that interview I had done with Shirley and I turned it into a book. So this is a really fun book as an introduction to the war because it has a mystery in it. So if you have young readers that like to read, this would be the book for them to choose. The mystery is that, as you can see, that's my character Helen on the front cover. She is running towards the West Clocks factory. Now, before the war, the West Clocks factory made watches and clocks, and lots of your grandparents, great-grandparents might copies or those kinds of clocks in their home. So it was a very popular clock, and then during the war, the factory was made into a war factory. So the West Clocks factory was the place to work. Character is 14 years old and she's working in the war factory. Her job is to put timing devices on bombs, which is a very job for a child and kind of scary job for a child. So you can see she's running towards the Clocks factory because she does not want to be late for work. So in the story, she also winds up helping a woman who lives across the street, who's what we call a recluse. A recluse, she never leaves her home, not even to get food. And Helen can hear her screaming and crying all the time, but she doesn't know why. So she decides to find out what happened to this woman and try to help her. So that's the mystery in the story. But you also get to learn about what it was like to be a child during the war. And you're going to see something really fun on the cover of this book. So sometimes people will see that character and they'll say, she looks a little bit like you, which is not a coincidence. So when I was writing my books, children were my editors. So at night, they would read my new chapters and my new scenes, and they would tell me what parts were good and what parts were boring, and I would fix those parts, and they were my editors. And so when the book was done, my daughter Lydia said to me, Mom, I think I look like Helen in your book. I think you should put me on the cover of your book. And I thought that was a great idea. So I had my illustrator draw my daughter onto the cover of the book. Now, she was 11 at the time, the character's 14. So I got to see what my daughter was going to look like when she was a teenager. And that, of course, is exactly what she looked like, except she doesn't, have 1940s hair and 1940s clothes. So in the back of all of the Homefront Heroes books, you will find a section called Meet the Real Homefront Hero that will tell you what parts of the story are true and what parts are made up. Because again, I write fiction, which means there are some made up parts in my stories. So in the back of the book, you get to meet the real person. I tell you about the real person that I wrote about. And then I tell you more about what it was like to be a child during World War II. So in this book, for example, we're talking about victory gardens and going to greet the troop trains when they came through town and that sort of thing. So this story takes place in Illinois, in the Illinois Valley. So that's the first book. The second book is called The No-No Boys. Now, The No-No Boys is set in a Japanese internment camp, Tule Lake, in California. And it's actually based on three people mainly on two of them. Mas Yamasaki, who is the person you see on the cover of the book, and George Nakano. George Nakano was my high school PE teacher. Now, PE was my worst subject, I will confess. But one day he came and he spoke to my history class about having been a child in the Tule Lake internment camp in California. And so when I went to write the book, I called him up after all those years and he remembered me, not because I was his best student in PE, but he just remembered me because he was also my driver's ed teacher. So anyway, this book is based on George Nakano's memories and on Mas Yamasaki's memories. So that's Mas on the cover. We got a picture of him when he was a child and we drew him onto the cover of the book. You can see that that's a depiction of the camps, how many of the camps looked, including the guard tower with the guard in the tower. In real life, the character probably would not have been able to get that close to the fence because the guard would have yelled at him to back up. So we took a little bit of liberty with that cover. You can see that he's wearing an outfit that would have been very common and very popular in the camp at that time. That jacket was sort of the jacket that every boy in that time period wanted to have. And you can see the cuffs on his jeans are rolled up quite a bit. That was a style as well. So the Japanese internment camps came about because the Japanese American families living on the West Coast in California, Washington, and Oregon were told by our government, the US government, that they had to move to these camps So one of our enemies during World War II, of course, was Japan. And our government was afraid that if your family was Japanese American, you might help support the Japanese if they invaded our country, or that you might, be involved in some sabotage on the West Coast. So we took Japanese American families, and many of the kids especially were American citizens, and we put them into these camps. So he would have gone with his entire family to this camp and stayed there for most of the war. So when kids read this book, they get to read about what it was like to live in the camps. You can see he's still a regular kid. He loves basketball. He's school. He's got a crush on a girl. So he's trying to just live a regular life. But his older brother is involved in a group called the No-No Boys. Now, the No-No Boys were a group of young men who refused to sign the loyalty oath to America because they thought what had been done to them was wrong. And they got into some trouble in the camp. His brother wants him to be a no-no boy, and his father wants him to stay out of trouble and be true to America. So when kids read this book, they get to decide, what would you do in that situation? What's the right thing? What does loyalty mean? What does friendship mean? And so this is a really good story, an adventurous kind of story for kids to learn some history. Again, in the back of the book, they get to learn a little bit more about the Japanese experience during the war, including the 442nd Combat Troop, which was a Japanese American combat troop, the most decorated troop in the war. So the next book then is called V for Victory. And this is the third book in the series. V for Victory is based on my family's stories of being Mexican American and living in San Antonio during World War II. You can see that there's the grocery store again, because that's the store that my ran. Our name is not Montoya, that's just the name of the character. So you can see a little bit of a piñata in the window that tells you it's a Mexican store. And you can see that this character, Miguel, is standing there. It's based on my Uncle Roman. My Uncle Roman, as you can see him on the right there, he's standing there with my Aunt Celia, was sold in the story. And he wants to help run the cash. He wants an important job at the store, and all they're letting him do is dust the cans and put up displays and clean the store. And so he's trying to prove that he's very responsible. So one thing he's doing is that he's trying to win a scrap metal contest. So you can see in the wagon, he's got all kinds of scrap metal, things that are made out of metal, pots and pans and springs. So local movie theater is sponsoring this contest, but during World War II, President Roosevelt himself appealed to the children, and he said, the men are fighting, the women are working, you kids have to help us win this. And one of the things he asked children to do was to collect scrap metal, which was then melted down, and that's what was made into the planes and the jeeps and the weapons that we fought the war with. So Miguel is trying to win a scrap metal contest. And you can see there's also something else interesting in that wagon. There's a baby boy. So if the men are fighting and the women are working, whose job is it to take care of the little kids, the older kids? So he gets stuck dragging his little nephew around, his nephew everywhere he goes. And Victor causes him all kinds of problems. So if you have readers in your life that like to read books that are funny, this would be the book for them, because my uncle was a bit of a rascal and he gets into a lot of trouble. He's also trying to keep a bully away from his stash, who's trying to steal his stash of metal. So the fun things about this cover is that is my actual uncle. And when we drew him onto the cover and I sent him the picture, I said, what do you think? Do you think the illustration looks like you? And he said, it does. She even got my big ears. So he was happy with the illustration. We needed a really cute baby for the wagon. So of course I chose who I thought was the cutest baby I could think of, which is my son. So when my son was 15 years old, this book came out, but on the cover of his baby pictures, and we put him on the cover of the book. Now, another interesting detail about the cover of this book, as you can see, is the Blue Star banner hanging in the window of the grocery store. So Blue Star banners hung in many families' windows and businesses' windows, and the Blue Star indicated someone who was in the military, serving in the military. If they died while in service, it was changed to a gold. And so my uncle talked about how sad it was to walk around the neighborhoods and see the gold stars in the windows and know that they had lost someone in the war. I wanted to make sure we put that detail on the cover of the book too. So V for Victory is a great story. Many of my books have a glossary in the back. This one has a glossary with the Spanish words that are in the book. The No No Boys has a glossary with Japanese words in the book. And then I'm going to tell you about the next book, which is called Wave Me Goodbye. And Wave Me Goodbye is the fourth book in the series. This one's based on a woman named Rosalind Arnstein. Rosalind was a Jewish girl in the Bronx during World War II, which is in New York City. She was the only Jewish girl in her neighborhood, believe it or not, which was mostly a German and Italian neighborhood. And so she got bullied a lot for being Jewish. And I talk about that in the book. And she strikes up an interesting and unusual friendship. You can see there's another fence here, and there's a boy behind the fence. She's handing him a comic book. It's actually a Superman comic book. They form a friendship. He is living in an orphanage. And that's the actual orphanage. It was located in Pelham Gardens, and he lives in the orphanage. He's an English boy who was sent to America for safekeeping. So he's a refugee from the war. So during World War II, the Germans were bombing London, and he lived in an orphanage in London, and they were afraid for him. So the government sent them to America to be safe, not knowing that those kids would spend the entire war in America at this orphanage. So the two characters, Miriam and Chris, become friends through the fence. And this is a really interesting story for kids who like to read about friendship and what it's like to have a friend who's very different from you and someone that you can only relate to. You can't really play with them. You can just talk to them. What that relationship look like? So this book is really popular, especially with like my 5th grade students. And so one of the interesting things about this story too is that it touches on the Holocaust. So Miriam has relatives that are living over in Germany that they have lost touch with, and knows something terrible has happened to them, but she doesn't know exactly what. And so for new readers learning about the Holocaust, this is a good book because it doesn't take you straight to the camps. As we know, Hitler and the Nazis in Germany started concentration camps in Germany, and they were labor camps and they were camps, and 6 million Jews were sent to those camps that died in the camps. A lot more than that were also sent to the camps, but 6 million Jews died in the concentration camps. And so this is a light introduction to the Holocaust and to what those stories are like. There's also a glossary in the back of this book with Hebrew and Yiddish words so that the kids can learn a little bit more of Miriam's family's Jewish tradition. So that is Rosalind there. You can see, you can't see it very well, but she's actually holding a bunch of puppies. It's a great picture of her from when she was a child, and she's holding a little litter of puppies. It's really cute. And then the boy is actually, that's the actual Rosalind who we drew onto the cover of the book. And then the boy is based on a family that I lived with in London for a while, and they had a son. And so that is kind of based loosely on him. So the last book is called War on a Sunday Morning. And this is the Pearl Harbor story. And this one is based on that I met right here in my town of Fort Collins, Colorado. Her name was Peggy Bocelli. And Peggy was a Navy officer's daughter who lived on the base, and she witnessed the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th. She saw it up close. In fact, that is the view that she would have had from her front yard. And you can see the planes are coming in. They're heading out towards the battleships, and they are sinking the battleships. And she saw all of that. She could feel the ground moving. When I came to the Pearl Harbor Memorial, one of the historians and I had to go and use a little bit of our detective work to try to figure out exactly where Peggy's house had been, because all we had to go by was a painting that her father had done right after the attack of the view he had of the attack. And you can see the painting on my website, and you'll see how we figured out where she lived on the base. So that's Peggy on the cover. And what I wanted to look at in this story, what happened to the women and girls in Pearl Harbor, which, by the way, I also wrote about in my book, Dancing in Combat Boots. There's a story there told from the adult perspective of what happened to the wives of the men who were stationed on the base and how difficult that was for them. In this case, I wanted to look at what happened to the children and the families that were evacuated into town to the YMCA and had to be safe and were worried about the men in their lives who were rushing to the base to be under fire. So Peggy's story was really important to me. But as I was researching this story, I also met a man who was a volunteer at Pacific Historic Parks, a beloved volunteer. Weston, if we could have the next slide, please. I'm going to show you Jimmy. This is Jimmy Lou. And many people at Pacific Historic Parks recognize this picture. Jimmy was an amazing man. He's passed away now. He used to speak to schools quite often. He too witnessed the Pearl Harbor attack. That's Jimmy there with his dog. And he was just a child when the attack happened. Jimmy was Chinese American. So he had the interesting experience of being mistaken by the American soldiers for being Japanese and for potentially being even an enemy, to the point where at one point they were startled when he came out of the cane fields, and a soldier actually put a bayonet to his throat because he thought maybe he was a Japanese soldier sneaking around. And so Jimmy told me these stories, and I wanted Jimmy's stories to make it into the book too. So Jimmy is a friend of my main character, whose name is Rose. In the book, his name is also Jimmy, because I tried giving that character different names and they just never stuck. Jimmy was such a strong personality for me that he got his name in the book. So in the back of War on a Sunday Morning, you're going to see a glossary that has some Hawaiian terms and also some military terms so that the kids can learn a little bit more about the military terms. So those are the books. And then the next slide will show you, this year, we were able to do a translation of V for Victory. So V for Victory is kind of special because there are not that many historical fiction novels for children that have Mexican-American characters in them. And so since this was my family's story, I thought it was really important for kids like me to recognize themselves in the books that they read. And I work with a lot of nonprofits where I do book giveaways. And these nonprofits primarily work with kids that are at risk, low income, and Latino families. So we wanted to have the book available for those nonprofits and also for the schools. So I work with a lot of schools that have Spanish-speaking students. Maybe they're newly arrived to the country and they're still learning the language, and we wanted them to be able to read these books and read about American history alongside their peers. And so the Spanish translation of V for Victory, V de la Victoria, came out this year, and I'm very excited and very proud of that book. And so you can see there to the right is a picture of my Mexican-American family. That would have been around the time of World War II. And my uncle is in the group of kids. And so this is a really fun picture. You can also find this on my website as well. And then the next slide is actually last year, I published my first book that was not a World War II book. This book is called Bursts of Brilliance for a Creative Life. And it's based on a weekly blog that I write to inspire the inner artist in everyone and to help people tap into their own creative brilliance. And so this book is actually based on really much, a lot of my personal experiences, the experience of my artist friends, and just my philosophies about being an artist and being a creative person, and how every single one of us has that in us. And so when you go to my website, you will see this book. It is not a World War II book, but I am very proud of it. And my weekly blog is on that Bursts of Brilliance website that you see there. So the next slide, I know we have a lot of teachers on the call today, and I'm very excited about that. And I wanted to draw your attention to some more of the things that you will find on my website, because we've made my website really interactive and fun for anybody who's interested in World War II. So if you go to the author page, you're going to see pictures, more pictures like the ones you just saw, of the real Homefront heroes. You're going to see them when they were babies and when they were children and when they were adults. And even when they were older, most of them were in their 80s when I interviewed them. So you will see those pictures of the real people that I interviewed. On my resources page, you can find a recommended reading list for kids who want to read more about World War II and teenagers who want to read more about World War II, and some great books listed there. On my Giving Back page, you'll learn more about my efforts to work with nonprofits around the country to support history and to make sure that our kids are learning about World War II, and also literacy and home libraries, which to me, home libraries are really critical because many kids do not own a single book in their home. And yet we know that book ownership increases test scale scores, it increases graduation rates. It's really important to reading at grade level. And so home libraries is something that we're encouraging, and we're always trying to get a lot of books out to kids so that they can own them. I have a teacher resources page for those of you who are teachers where you can access information about my virtual and in-person visits and all kinds of additional information. And you can even apply to get a classroom set of books for your class. And then you're also going to find lots of writing resources, because I am a writer's coach. I'm closed to new clients right now, but I have lots of resources and tools for writers and aspiring writers and people who want to write historical fiction. And I really want to encourage you to check out that information as well. And then you'll see my email address if you have a book club or an organization and you're interested in a speaker, or you just have more questions, or you want to share one of your family's stories. I'd love it if you could reach out to me. So before we open to questions, I did want to answer the question I get asked the most often by the students, and that is when I knew I wanted to be a writer. And I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was in the 5th grade, and something very interesting happened to me. So this is back in the 1970s. And at that time period, teachers were a lot stricter than they are now. So we were given an assignment to write a poem. And I mean, I was a good student, but sometimes I didn't always do my homework. But this time around, this poem was really, really important to me. I really wanted to get this poem right. And so I stayed up past my bedtime. I got in trouble with my mother, and I wrote this poem and I turned it in. And I thought it was pretty good. Well, a day later, the teacher called me up in front of the entire class, and she said, "You did not write this poem. No 5th grade student could write a poem this good. You must have copied it out of a book. Now go home and write this poem yourself, or you are not getting a grade." And I was horrified. And I walked back to my desk, and I could hear kids laughing at me. I heard one kid say, "You cheated." And I did not cheat, was very upset by that. I got back to my desk and I was almost crying. But sometimes we have something happen in life that's a bad thing, a difficult thing that turns out to be a good thing too. And as I was sitting at my desk, I had this interesting thought. And I said to myself, wow, I must be a really good writer. And once I realized that I was good at something and I loved doing it, I had something that I could be really excited about. And so all through junior high and high school, I wrote, and my teachers were all very complimentary of my writing. And they all said, "You should be a writer when you grow up." And my parents thought that too. And so I got a lot of encouragement about being a writer when I grew up. My teachers sent my stories to the district magazines. They sent me to the Young Writers Conference. And then when I got to my senior year of high school, and people said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "Well, I want to be a writer." And all of a sudden, everybody said, "That's not a job, that's a hobby." And I was like, "It is?" I had no idea it was a hobby. And so now I needed a new plan. What was I going to do? And I was very discouraged. And then I remembered that I loved history. And so I decided to get my degree in history because I thought if I ever do write, I'd like to write about history. And then after college, I had a couple of dead-end jobs that I hated. And one day I said to myself, is this life? Am I gonna work jobs I don't enjoy? And who says you can't be a writer? Like, why am I letting other people tell me what I can do with my life? So I quit my jobs and I decided to become a writer, and I started a freelance writing business. I wasn't entirely sure what that was, but I started writing for newspapers and magazines, and I wrote some brochures and I wrote some copy for people. And I just kind of started my little business as a freelance writer. And that was 29 years ago. So for 29 years, I have been a professional writer, even though they told me that being a writer wasn't a job. And I did get to write about the thing that I loved. I got to write about history for 7 books. So that's one encouragement I always have for young writers is it might take you a while to get where you want to be. Start writing my books immediately. I had to do other kinds of writing first so that I could pay my bills. But eventually I did get to write my books, and I got to write short stories, and I got to write things that I wanted to do. So it might take you a little while, but you will get there, and you will get to write the things that you want to write. And so that's the question I get asked the most often about my writing and my World War II story. but I know that we want to give you some time to ask some questions as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Teresa, for everything. First off, I actually use Dancing in Combat Boots. That's one of my favorite books. I made my niece read it so that she understood, what women had to go through. So actually, I wanted to ask you a question on that before I open up to everyone else. I apologize.
Sure.
What do you want women, especially young women, to learn or get out of Dancing in Combat Boots?
Oh, that's a great question. As I said, prior to World War II, World War II changed things for women in a number of ways. Before the war, there were a lot of jobs that were closed to women. The assumption was that women would not be able to do them well. And so, for example, all the women who worked in the factories building the airplanes during World War II, there was a lot of trepidation about that. A lot of the men workers thought, well, the women are not going to be able to do it well enough. They won't be strong enough. They won't be smart enough. They won't have the work ethic. And in the end, the women proved them wrong. The women had better rates of turning out these airplanes that didn't have any problems with them than the men did. And when I asked one of the women, why was that? Why did you guys do such a great job? She said, well, it was our husbands and sons flying those planes. You don't think we were going to let anything happen to them, do you? So I think the fact that they were women helped them, that they had community spirit that women have of doing not just a good job for themselves, but for the benefit of everyone. And what happened after World War II was that society realized that women could do all of these jobs that they previously thought they could not do. And so it really opened a lot of doors. And for the women that I talked to, it changed them forever. It enabled them to see themselves as much more capable and strong. And many of them had to be breadwinners during World War II, which was not a job that women had had before. So what I hope young girls take from reading this book is that no matter what you feel might be a restriction in your life, or people that are telling you there are things you cannot do, if you remember the women of World War II paved the way for us, and they showed that we can do whatever we want to do when we put our minds to it. So I think it's a very, very inspiring story. So thank you for asking that question.
No, thank you very much. And then I actually have a question from Janet. Janet, I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can ask your question yourself.
First of all, I want to thank you. You inspired me because my grandson is a senior in college and is a history major in World War II.
Oh.
Anyway, my question is, was there anyone's story story that really surprised you when you interviewed them? Or was there someone that really stuck out in your mind or in your heart when you heard their story?
Yes, there are actually several people. And I can still hear all the voices of all of the people that I interviewed. They're locked into my mind forever. But I remember as a historian and as a journalist, I'm trained to go into stories with objectivity. I'm not supposed to come into it from, a certain view of what I think they might say. But I accidentally, in the back of my mind, expected to talk to the woman who had been in the Japanese internment camp, that she would have a lot of resentment about what had happened to her, and that her story would be filled with anger because, they'd lost everything. They'd lost their home, their business, when they were sent to the camps. And she was very honest about those feelings, but at the same time, she said, but if it hadn't been for the camps, I wouldn't have met my husband. I wouldn't have had my son. I wouldn't have had the lifelong friendships that I have now. That really surprised me. And then another one was the African-American woman that I interviewed who was a WAC. And again, I thought she would talk exclusively about the segregation, being a woman, but also being Black. And she did. And she was very honest about that. And that's in the story. But she also told me, but honey, I was freer than I have ever been when I was in the Army, because I was out of my small segregated Southern town and out from under the thumb of my domineering mother and grandmother, and I could make my own decisions for the first time. And so I think what really surprised me about these stories is that I went in expecting certain kinds of our view of history, and they were very honest about what did happen to them, but they were also honest about how they grew from those experiences. And I think that was really fascinating to me.
Thank you, Teresa. So I have another question. Trying to unmute them right now, but I don't think they can hear me. So I will ask for them. So during your V for Victory book, on the cover, you have that blue star banner. Did you happen to have any family members serving in World War II?
Yes, in a peripheral way we did. None of my grandfathers served in the war. But I did have, through my mom's family, the Mexican-American family, we had some cousins and uncles that fought in the war. And so that was kind of where that inspiration came from. I didn't really know them very well, but my uncle had known them. And so that's why we wanted to talk about that. Another interesting detail was back then, if you were, some of our family members, or the ones that were married into the family, were not yet American citizens. And back then, if you fought for this country, it was deemed that if you were willing to fight for the country, you should be a citizen of the country. And so many of them achieved their citizenship by fighting for our country. So that is another aspect of the story that I think is very interesting.
Thank you. So I got a question from a school group, and they're asking, what got you into history so young?
What got me into history so young? Well, when I was in Idaho, in the 4th grade, the governor would give these patches, or these little circular patches that you could like sew onto your clothes, kind of like a Boy Scout patch or a Girl Scout patch. And it was called the Prospectors Club, because Idaho, of course, is a mountainous area. We had a lot of mines and gold mines and silver mines. And so it was called the Prospectors Club. And I was sick the day that they handed out those patches. So when I came the next day and it was sitting on my desk and I saw that I was the only one in the whole classroom who got it, I thought the governor had particularly chosen me to be in his elite prospectors club, and that somehow he must have known that I was interested in history. And so from then, I didn't know that all the kids had gotten it. So from then on, I was like, I thought I was pretty special, and I was really going to study history, and I was going to be very interested in history. And so I did. And then it never to me. I still read lots of historical fiction. It's my favorite type of book to read. I still read lots of historical fiction and nonfiction about World War II, even though I've been doing this for 30 years. So I never have outgrown my love of history. It's my favorite subject.
Great, thanks. So we got a few more questions. Who was your favorite character out of all your books, and why?
That is an impossible question for me to answer, because it's like asking me which one of my 3 children is my favorite. So when you're an author and you're writing a book, you kind of fall in love with your characters. And so while you're writing that book is sort of your favorite book, and the character is sort of your favorite character because you're immersed in writing it. And so as I was writing each character, I just loved all of them. And now that they're all done, I think they're all really special, especially with the children's books, because with those books, each character represents, all the characters are ages 12 to 14. They all represent a different way that we all feel when we're 12, 13, 14 years old. Miriam is that kind of kid who's, kind of carries the weight of the world on her shoulders. She cares about everybody. She wants to help everybody. A lot of kids that are 12, 13, 14 feel that way. Helen is very responsible, and she wants to show everyone that she can take care of her family. In that story, her father has died, her mother has passed away, and she's the one to earn the money for the family. And so in each of, there's a little bit of me when I was that age, and there's a little bit of you when you're that age. And so each of the characters is real to me.
Okay, so I guess we have one more question, and I think this is probably one of the most important ones that we're going to ask today. Any upcoming stories that you're planning on to write? I'm sure we'd all love to hear about it.
That is a great question. And in the past, I would have been able to tell you yes, but I actually, War on a Sunday Morning is the last book in the series, because as a writer, I'm very unusual, as I said. All of my books are real people that I interviewed. And most of the people that I have interviewed, except for my uncle, they've all passed away now. So most of them were in their 80s and early 90s when I talked to them. And so I had a decision to make as a writer. going to continue to write stories that were just made up, that were just based on something someone told me maybe, but not be able to talk to the real person. And I decided that I did not want to do that. My whole career had been about honoring real people and telling their stories and naming them, and that I wanted this book to be the last book because the people that I could talk to now are either too elderly or they've passed away for me to talk to them. So I'm really proud of this collection because it is real people, but it does mean that, yes, that type of writing for me is now done. And there might be more writing coming, probably more on the inspirational side and the encouragement for creatives and artists that I've been writing. It'll probably be more along that line.
Oh, thank you very much, Teresa. We really appreciate you talking to us today. So on behalf of Pacific Historic Parks, we would like to thank you all for joining us today. Teresa, it's been an honor to have you share your experience with us, and we appreciate your willing to share and your whole author's journey and the importance of all of these books. And I'm pretty sure you've inspired future historians and writers today. So everyone, just heads up, please be on the lookout in your registration email, as you will be sent a special discount code to purchase any of Teresa's books from our online bookstore, Pacific Historic Parks. And then also in the chat box, we will be dropping a link so you can share your feedback as well. If you have any other questions, please message us as well, and I'll be happy to pass that along. Other than that, anything else you wanted to say, Teresa?
No, just thank you very much for having me, and I hope happy holidays to everyone, and I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Teresa. Mahalo.